Here's an interesting thing I want to talk to you about. This is a tasting I did about 3 weeks ago for the first time. And I did it because I was supposed to talk about the Spring Wine Club from 2020. And what happened was Alana Fontaine, my assistant winemaker, said, I know you're talking about 17 Temperance Hill Vineyard Pinot Noir, but you should taste the 16 against it because it's really interesting. And she was right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these two wines, compare and contrast. 2016, 2017. I make wines to tell a story. The story is first and foremost the place. That's the important part. If you taste my wines from different vineyards and they taste the same, or taste very similar, then I've failed. But for me, it's important that you can taste the place. The other thing that's important is that for me, from a style standpoint, is that the wines are about food. And it's true. I think about wine and food. The other thing that's really important in this story is the vintage. And there are winemakers that say, well, I'm supposed to make good wine that's good every year. And I'm like, well, yeah, you should make wine that's good every year. But I don't believe you should make wine that tastes the same from vintage to vintage. I think the vintage is part of the story. After all, half of the grapevine grows anew from pruned canes. All of the structures, including all of the things that produce grapes, are all new, and they live, they grow, they provide us fruit in a particular growing season. If you can't tell the difference between growing seasons that are very different, I also think you haven't done a good job of that sense of place, because it's also in the space-time continuum, it's the space and the time. So these two wines came from really different vintages. I think they're both really good, and they basically are rated very similarly, but they're very different because the season where those grapes grew from little bitty flowers to mature clusters that we picked were very different. So what's the difference? 2016 was early. It was the third of a string of 3 vintages where the bloom, which is the beginning of the grape's development, bloom was actually the very beginning of June. 2017, bloom was 3 weeks later. The grapes are on the plant from the flower to the time we pick them, about 100 to 105 days. And so if you start later, you are picking later in the fall. The sun, after June 21st, is heading back south. So this angle of the sun is getting lower and lower and lower as you get later and later in the year. And thus, the amount of light intensity drops. As the angle of incidence drops, the amount of light on the cluster changes. And I always say it's relatively straightforward. If you put me in a lot of heat and you give me a lot of light, I'm going to make a lot of fresh, big, fruity kinds of flavors. And if you mature me later at lower light and cooler temperatures, I'm going to have more other things, more complexity, and the fruit won't be as jammy, as over, kind of almost on the edge of overripe. So the 17 vintage being later in the season in cooler temperatures has a lot more freshness, a lot more vibrancy. It's like eating the fresh fruit. Where the 16, because it matured earlier, and the end of the growing season was very warm in 16, right about the time we were picking, you get this more flamboyant, more textural, more juicy, jammy kind of almost compote-y kind of textural quality to the 16. So when you put the two of them next to each other, you actually see Temperance Hill, you see the smoke, the cherry quality, the nice spiciness, the nice acidity behind the juiciness, but the package is fundamentally different. So if you like big, rich, textural, jammy kinds of wines, you're going to love the 16. If you love fresh, vibrant, acidity that's just right there, makes your mouth water, you're going to like the 17. And if you're like me, It just depends on what I'm going to eat. If I'm going to have some grilled leg of lamb, I'm going to drink the 16. If you're going to eat salmon and you want that fresh quality of a really good piece of salmon, the 17 might be a better choice. Okay. One of the nice things about this pairing is to do it with friends, because you have a bunch of people, 4 or 6 within your social bubble, we'll call it, and you get together and you open this bottle and you cook something on the grill, and you open these 2 bottles and say, here, I've got Temperance Hill from 2 really different vintages. What do you think? You essentially have a discussion about what people like about wine, and everybody gets to have their opinion, because as far as I'm concerned, they're equally good. They're just different. They're a different expression of this place in these 2 very different vintages. This doesn't happen very often that I can bring you 2 wines like this that tell this really interesting story. So crack them open, get the charcoal hot, put something on it. I don't care other than your hand. Don't put your hand on it. But put something tasty on the grill and invite some friends over and have at it. I guarantee you'll have fun.